It's proof that football's not really about winning, and it sure as hell isn't about sort of art or beauty. Something else is going on.
Welcome back to the assistant professor of football. After all the traveling and the activism in the last episodes, it's fall and we sit down with a good book this time. And next time in 2 weeks as well, because I talked to David Goldblatt today. Literally today, when you listen to this episode or when it comes out. Or, like my students would say, like literally today. And then I turned this recording around and here it is, later than normal on Mondays, but voila. I was a little starstruck when David showed up on my screen today. I'll admit, I've never met him, but I have been a fan of his writing for a long time now. Some of you may have read his books, The Games, for example, subtitle A Global History of the Olympics, and the two famous and very well-selling football ones, The Game of Our Lives, The Meaning and Making of English Football, and especially The Ball is Round. That one, Simon Cooper, and he's not nobody, said is the seminal football history. David is a sociologist. He has a part-time academic home in the US as well at Pitzer College in LA. And this one, Injury Time, is a book for the moment. The thesis is simple. David says a lot of the spaces for communitarianism have been devolved in neoliberal Great Britain, and I think that's a fairly common diagnosis. The soap operas of TV even no longer draw anywhere near as many viewers and common experiences than 20, 30 years ago, but soccer, he says, soccer has replaced it. Actually, more than that. In fact, soccer has become England's dominant soap opera in this era. So football is the dominant cultural form in modern Britain, not just a reflection or a mirror, but his words, the central metaphorical space in which the country speaks with itself. It's in the game, he believes, that English people might most clearly see themselves, the good and the bad, and the potential for the good and the bad. It's a gripping book, and no worries, we'll need a pretty hefty political timeline here. So we'll check off the crucial political and cultural sea changes in England over the last decades at the beginning of the conversation, Brexit and all. So you have those names down, because this is an exercise in contemporary history, in cultural studies, not just in soccer writing, because it's David Goldblatt, after all. So here we go. Part 1 today, part 2 next week, because our conversation was an hour and a half long. 2 recommendations before we get there. If you understand German, check out the brand new documentary of German's public broadcaster, ARD, or BR, on the rise and fall of 1860 Munich. Quite entertaining. And a VPN might help if you're not in Germany. And second, please rate this podcast or leave a comment on the podcast app of your choice. Every now and then I have the urge to see if it makes a difference. So perhaps right now you can do that. While this beautiful London mocking song is running, it's from Catatonia, a Welsh band. They were big in college radios in the late 90s, just as Tony Blair and New Labour replaced Margaret Thatcherism in Britain. And that's a topic for David. So let's go. David Goldblatt, it's an honor to have you here. David is a British sports writer, sociologist by training, journalist, writer. The most famous book you will know by him is The Ball is Round, A Global History of Football. And he's up to another book here, Injury Time. We'll talk a little bit about the intro to the book and how it came to be. But for starters, David, what's your football soccer story? Do you go to grounds? Do you go to games? Who do you support? What's your context in the game?
My football story. So I inherited Tottenham Hotspurs from my father and my grandfather. Pretty standard choice for North London Jews of the mid-century. And I was an obsessive as a child, particularly on the statistical front, a memorizer of tables and players and records. And I even sellotaped together graph paper and had a big thing of graph paper on my bedroom wall where I plotted Arsenal and Tottenham's relative positions through the 1974-75 season, having seen it in the football. I think the Topical Times football annual, the coach of Fulham apparently used to do the same. Anyway, I was completely besotted, and my father was a regular attender midweek because he worked the markets on a Saturday selling coats and dresses. And he went to Tottenham a lot in those days. Midweek, UEFA Cup, that was a big thing. And I begged him and begged him and begged him to take me to football. And eventually he took me to an England-Scotland game at Wembley. I lived in a suburb of actually West London called Ruislip, which is just down the road. So anyway, we go to Wembley, and of course it's totally mind-blowing. I'm 8 years old, huge green rectangle, hairs on the back of, neck standing up. Incredible. Can't remember a damn thing about the game. Anyway, we left early, as was my father's wont. I'm against. And in those days, Wembley was a sort of, actually a very rickety old stadium in the middle of a giant unstructured car park. So it was quite good to get out early. And we're walking towards the car, and suddenly the path is barred by 5 or 6 Scottish teenagers in full kind of saltire tartan regalia. And I, in my youthful innocence, thought they were the pop band, the Bay City Rollers, who you may or may not have come across, who did sort of Scottish teen kitsch. Anyway, they weren't, and they weren't moving. And so my father said to them, in his gruffest voice, well, you can have me, boys, but 3 of you are going to fucking hospital. So, who is first? And the ways parted. And we got into the car and we drove home, and he never went to a football game again. I mean, I think he was going that way anyway, because, in the early 1970s, Tottenham games were rough. There was a very rough, very disordered element at Tottenham. So I was a bit stuck. What am I going to do? No uncle, no older brother. Tottenham's like difficult to get to from Ruislip as an 8-year-old. So I didn't go to football. And I always followed Tottenham all through my teens and into my early 20s, but I didn't go. And what brought me back to football, like a lot of people in England, is the 1990 World Cup and, Gazza's tears and that whole thing. And the same year, a friend of mine from university, who was a very regular Arsenal attender, said to me one Saturday afternoon, would you like to go and see Arsenal versus Charlton, 4th round of the FA Cup at Charlton? I've got tickets. I thought, well, why not? So off we went, and by this point I'm doing a PhD in sociology, and I walk out of the station at Charlton, and it's like every sociological neuron in my brain then explodes. I'm going, oh my God, social identity, social occupation and conflict over space, structure and agency, hidden rules and traditions. They're all here in front of me, and the scales are falling from my eyes. And we go in a sort of sociological daze into the game, and we're sitting with the Arsenal away fans, which is it's really funny, a lot of singing. And they had a cult substitute called Perry Groves, who was not very good but was much loved. And the song was to the tune of the Beatles' The Yellow Submarine, We All Live in a Perry Groves World. And he started warming up on, I think, in the second half. And the Arsenal fans just knew exactly when to simultaneously start singing. And I just thought that's such an interesting sociological phenomenon, and it's completely hysterical. So I was hooked. And, here we are nearly 35 years later, that journey, but that's how it begins. These days, I live in Bristol, which is a city in the west of England, about 100 miles from London, quite close to the Welsh border. And I moved down here about 25 years ago, and Tottenham Hotspurs keeps me interested in the Premier League. But, my local lost my heart to the local squeeze, which is Bristol Rovers, the smaller of the two clubs in Bristol, neither of whom can claim a very distinguished football history, despite
the largest city in Britain to not have a Premier League team, right?
Yeah, I mean, Bristol City have only had maybe 6-8 seasons in the top flight, and that's all pre-Premier League. Bristol Rovers have had 6 seasons in the second level of English football. The rest has been spent in the third and fourth. I would say, their natural position is the lower third of the third level of English football. And that's where they've been really for most of what is now actually 140 years. But what I love about Bristol Rovers, that it's proof that football's not really about winning, and it sure as hell isn't about sort of art or beauty. Something else is going on. And Rovers, it's amazing. Here we are in the fourth level, not playing very well, still getting 8,000 to 10,000 people showing up, and, in good voice. So I find that a very compelling space to be in, I find it very humorous, very funny a lot of the time. It's also where, like a lot of people, it's about kind of who you go with and who you see and the connections you make and renew and reproduce in the process of consuming football. Last season I went to Tottenham 3 or 4 times in the end, because during the Europa Cup run, that was one of the only ways you could get a ticket if you weren't a regular. Mm-hmm. So it was really interesting, and such an amazing contrast to do the Tottenham Hotspur Stadium and the Memorial Stadium. And every now and again I go and see Bristol City. I'm not tribal about these things. I like to go and see some decent football, rarely available at Rovers. And City are pretty good. And they've got a really nice, proper inner-city stadium, 27,000 now, generally pretty full. And I've got a couple
Austrian coach.
Exactly. So what's not to like?
However, I will say Bristol Rovers, listeners, look it up. One of the best, if not the best, logo in British football. David
yes, the Pirates and quarters. I mean, I love the fact that Bristol Rovers playing blue and white quarters. Hardly anybody plays in quarters. I mean, occasionally Blackburn have done, but often it's just like blue and white halves. And Wickham, I believe, certainly in their change strip, go quarters. But it's great. I think, we really missed out in England on some of the more flamboyant forms of the heraldic language of football shirts. I mean, hardly anyone, uses the diagonal bend across the shirt. Man City once in a while, Crystal Palace once in a while, but like River Plate look amazing with their red sash, Yeah. We missed that, and like barely any hoops, like after Celtic and QPR, where are the hoops? Anyway, we have quarters at Bristol Rovers. It gives me a pleasure.
Good, and we want more hoops. And the question of whether the experience in the Memorial Stadium at Bristol and Tottenham Hotspur Stadium, the new one, gives you the same kind of England already leads us a bit closer to the book. The thesis of which really is, and you expand on this as you wish, but football is if not the largest, sharpest prism through which to view British society over the last decades. Since a lot of you out there, listeners, are British, or may not be familiar with what's happened in Britain the last few decades, it might be worth to a little reminder, and David, collaborate here with me. Financial crisis, is that a fine place to start?
Well, I would go back slightly further, and it's useful for American listeners in particular to say, the story of English football, the story of British society. 1979 is the break point, as 1980 is in the United States. It's Thatcher in Britain, it's Reagan in the United States. And that begins a process still incomplete and still ongoing of the neoliberalization of what were once, relatively social democratic mixed economies, and a period of privatization of state assets, the destruction of trade unions, probably the most important element, the financialization and deregulation of all capital markets, and the enormous globalization of those capital markets.
Privatization of housing plays a role.
Certainly,
in the book story as well. That belongs in there too.
A huge sell-off of housing, social housing in Britain. And that continues until 1997 in Britain, when the Conservatives fall after 17 years. So they last longer than the Reagan-Bush years. Mm-hmm. And they're replaced by Tony Blair and then Gordon Brown and the New Labour Project, which is a pretty milquetoast social democracy. It does repair the country to a certain extent. It does take the roughest and harshest edges off the previous 17 years. It is an era of economic boom, but the fundamentals are left intact. I mean, with Thatcher, when asked, what is your greatest legacy, she said New Labour. And, the same could be said really of the Dems, I would say, after Reagan. Both Clinton and Obama, in economic terms, barely scratched the surface. I mean, of course, one can have too much of a comparison, but I think there is quite a good comparison. And the Premier League is, although it emerges in 1992, and 93, towards the end of the Conservative Party's rule, it's really a creature of the New Labour years. In 1997, I mean, it's interesting to think that the Premier League, for its first few years, it's not that different from the kind of old school industrial working class English football of the previous 100 years.
Yeah, no, it looks, if you look at early TV footage from the Premier League too, it doesn't look anywhere near as glamorous.
Exactly. There are 17
pitches
players.
Look the same, and the kind of football. Yes.
Apart from Eric Cantona. Cantona is the first kind of foreign star. And in 1997, the broadcast money triples. And that's the moment that things really begin to change. I felt things changed when suddenly Juninho, the Brazilian, and Ravanelli were playing at Middlesbrough, which is just Middlesbrough. I don't know what the reference in the States would be, but it's Youngstown. And it's suddenly, superstars are going to Youngstown. I thought, this is a change. So the Premier League booms for the next 13 years, as indeed Britain booms under New Labour. And then the key moments of the last decade or so are, of course, the global economic crisis of 2008, which blows all of that apart. And the greatest tragedy of that is that the right-wing press and the Conservative Party in this country mendaciously managed to turn what is essentially a crisis of unregulated global capitalism and private credit into a crisis of sovereign debt. And in actual fact, Britain's level of sovereign borrowing was, no greater than most OECD countries and substantially less than others. But politically, it was declared to be a crisis of sovereign debt. And so when New Labour lost power in 2010 to a coalition of the Conservatives and the Liberal Democrats, the most serious squeeze on the welfare state and public spending basically ever was unnecessarily implemented. And it tore this country apart. The austerity, the collapse of capital spending, the meanness of the benefit system, the harshness of the new labour contract, zero-hour contracts that came in, basically massively impoverished a considerable part of the country and the public realm. And it is that at least in part, that is the engine of the next huge moment, which is the Brexit vote. And there was, I mean, again, as in the United States, a growing far-right, nativist, sometimes white supremacist, often racist, series of social movements at work, coalescing around UKIP, the UK Independence Party, led in this era by Nigel Farage, who are doing very, very well with the protest vote. And the Conservative Prime Minister David Cameron, facing this threat on his right flank and within his own party, thought he would be able to settle the matter by having a no-holds-barred in or out referendum on EU membership. And what a gamble that was. And he lost it, 52% to 48%. You know, the most important decision Britain has made in the last, 100 years, decided by this sliver of voters in a very, very, very terrible campaign. And Brexit continues to be the mainspring, I would say, of politics in this country, because it is costing us in lost tax revenues, reduced growth, reduced exports, a couple of percentage points of the economy every single year. So you add that to austerity, and this country is beginning to look very, very ragged. And now, increasingly like the United States, has a very toxic, poisoned, polarized public debate. You then add to that COVID. Of course, COVID affects everybody, but Britain is peculiarly unresilient.
Maybe for timeline's sake, we should say we're in 2016 with the Brexit referendum.
That's right. 2016 Brexit.
David Cameron takes back power for the Conservatives in a coalition with the Liberal Democrats. But 2015 in the elections, UKIP already gets like 4 million votes.
Cameron becomes Prime Minister in 2010 with the Liberal Democrat coalition. That lasts till 2015. He's re-elected in 2015, but fearing his right flank, calls the referendum for 2016. It's held in the middle of Euro 2016. These things are not entirely unconnected. And they lose the vote 52-48. Yep. Then it is, then we have COVID. And we've come out of COVID in 2021, and a series of crises, some external, some internal, all connected, I think, in a way, have racked this country. Again, it's not unfamiliar territory for American listeners, but, the Ukraine war and the profound transformation of the international order and Britain's diminished place in the international order has been a huge element of politics here. A massive rise, I would say, in casual racism and in anti-migrant attitudes fueled by both the right-wing press and a very resurgent populist right-wing force headed by Farage called Reform. The climate crisis is here and is beginning to seriously affect all sorts of elements of British life. There's a mental health crisis on, again, not uncommon in Western societies. I think peculiarly acute in the UK, and a massive cost of living crisis as inflation eats into the living standards of the poorest half of society, who have already been beaten to hell. And then, throw in the death of the Queen. That's quite a moment. Yeah. Nearly 50 years, 50 years of the Queen. Oh my. 70, over 70 years, 53 is the coronation. She dies in 2023. So it's 70 years. Mm-hmm. A kind of huge moment, and whether one is a royalist or not, I think a deeply destabilizing moment. So you have a very rattled, very very divided, very polarized, increasingly unequal and unwell society grappling with extraordinary global change and having shot itself in the foot. Quite a difficult moment.
And yet the most watched league in the world, the football landscape with the most glamour. And that contrast is part of your story here. as well. You start the book by saying we used to have these soap operas and we used to watch them, and now football is our soap opera. Football, soccer is I don't know if you would say the only, but the central mode of collective storytelling, you say, in Great Britain.
Yeah, I think
when did you first start noticing that? When did the thesis for this book develop and you sat there in Bristol saying, all that's happening around me, here is the lens that really explains this really well?
So I think they're different. I mean, I'd already clocked the idea in Game of Our Lives, published in 2015, that football, it's a ritual. It's a form of public theatre, but it's also a soap opera. So I'd kind of, and part of what makes it such a powerful popular cultural force is that it's all three. It's not just one thing. And of course, it's a game that's played as well, and it has this vast hinterland of voluntary participation, which is intimately connected, actually, to the professional game in all sorts of ways. But I felt like there was a shift in the late teens and through COVID. And football is not just a reflection and a prism, though it is that. It's also increasingly a participant in some ways in these conversations. And I think the kind of moment for me, I was very stirred by Marcus Rashford's campaign during COVID to get the government to change its benefit payments so that kids who used to get free school meals but now weren't going to school because of the pandemic, like suddenly these families have got to find 10 extra meals a week. And he made the government change course twice. I thought this is an extraordinary thing. A 23-year-old striker from Manchester United is changing government welfare policy. Yeah. And that's because he's an amazing person, but it's because he's Manchester United at the time, That's that's a moment. And then I suppose the strike at Match of the Day, for your listeners who don't know Match of the Day, it's the Saturday night highlights program on the BBC. It's been going since 1964. It's literally the most hallowed element of the BBC's output. It's absolutely central to people's experience of English football.
It's an institution.
Literally everybody in the country, even if they hate football and have never watched Match of the Day, I guarantee they can sing the theme tune. It's sort of that kind of place in the cosmos. And Gary Lineker, ex-England player, has been the presenter for the last 25 years, is officially a national treasure, and has been busy on Twitter with, I would say, pretty progressive views. It was Twitter in those days. And he tweeted at one point that he thought the language that was being used to describe migrants by both the right-wing press and the government, the use of words like plague and swarm, was not dissimilar to that of Germany in the 1930s. And of course, he's absolutely right. This caused a gigantic storm. People were baying for his blood, and he was required by the BBC management to stand down temporarily while they thought about it. And as a consequence, all of his colleagues, both pundits and commentators, came out on strike, both on TV and radio. I mean, Alan Shearer, bless his soul, I love him. He's not a man with a lot of political views most of the time. I thought this was extraordinary. And so we were treated to Match of the Day, truncated to 20 minutes with no commentary and no punditry, because the BBC had only bought rights for imagery and then put its own commentary over the top. So it couldn't take the global commentary. And of course, it was unspeakable and terrible and unwatchable. And I just thought, this is what a moment. The most public, visible challenge to the discourse around migrants is coming from a footballer and a football highlight show. This is what is capturing the news. My God, we're in a different kind of space here.
Yeah.
And then the other impulse is that I have been wanting and hoping that somebody else would write the State of the Nation book that put all of this together. And while there have been good books on Brexit and there are books on COVID and there are books on austerity, I just didn't feel that anything was pulling it all together and putting it in one place. And I asked myself, would football, now the most popular form of culture, now what I consider to be the main storytelling, collective storytelling space in an otherwise irretrievably fragmented media space, would it carry the story of all of this? Could I write a State of the Nation book? Others will have to decide whether I did or I didn't. But that was, it's the confluence of all of these things around, I suppose, 2022, 2023 is when I'm really thinking about it. And it all comes together at that moment.
Yeah. I'll indulge you in a cultural pessimist critique here for a second, and I wonder if you've heard that, if indeed, and I think you do succeed in the sense that it carries. The story carries. Since that is so, oh my God, what does that say about a country? If football is the one prism that hold the one thing that holds this together, then we're really.
Yeah, I mean,
then we're really in trouble. I mean, if of all things is that if football is the bracket, have you heard that?
No, I mean, I say it to myself. I mean, I write in the preface to the book, I worry that we have invested too much of our political imagination and collective storytelling capacity in football. Mm-hmm. However, in the absence of anything better, I think we're very lucky to have it at all. I mean, that's not a good situation, but it isn't a good situation. Politicians have stopped telling stories. I mean, they tell conspiracy theories. They tell the sketchiest narratives, but these are. And I don't know if you know the word spivs. The spiv is the man during the Second World War selling off-ration bacon from the inside of his large overcoat on a street corner, right? Buying and selling stolen goods. That's a spiv. And that's what most politicians have become, if they haven't become, dead behind the eyes technocrats. The Labour Party has given up on telling a meaningful story about Britain. The Conservatives and Reform, the populists, tell one that is conspiracy theory. So where else are we going? I wish that the public, read more poetry than watch football. I wish that we listen to climate scientists more than we listen to, ex-professional pundits. But we don't. And we have to start from where we are. And that's what Injury Time is about.
At its best, then, do you think football in Britain today holds the potential to come up with a bigger narrative? I think the debate and division in Europe is in many ways unequally weighted. The big narrative for what this place, whatever place you're at, should look like in 10 years comes from the right, increasingly.
Sure.
And the story of resistance to fascism and whatever form that narrative takes that's not a vision. That's not enough of a central vision going forward. Does football at its best, do you think, hold the potential to tell the kind of story that Labour and everyone else outside of the right-wing bubble isn't able to tell right now?
Yes, is the short answer. The long answer is, football is the most extraordinary communitarian space in Britain. I mean, in a way, the battle against Thatcherite neoliberal individualism has diminished in its significance, but it has not gone away because that has gone deep into our public culture and collective consciousness. And football is a riposte to that. 1.4 million people are volunteering in football in Britain every year, which is 10 times the number of people volunteering for the Scout movement, 20 times the number of people volunteering for the National Trust, and the Scouts and the cumulative architectural heritage of the aristocracy that the National Trust now holds told,
Yeah.
were once very powerful instruments of social storytelling, and football just knocks them into a cocked hat. And I think there is a real hunger in Britain for situations and institutions and spaces where it's not about me, it's about we, it's about us. Of course, the problem is who is the us, and we will come back.
Yes.
Back to that. But that is a very, very powerful force and a very powerful corrective, and one that you just doesn't get enough noise in public debate. So there's that.
Mm-hmm. Food banks, along these lines, supporter-run food banks come to mind as well, just because I'm familiar with it from Western.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I mean, that's an amazing thing. I mean, it's such a tragedy, of course, that the demand for food banks in Britain is so great. The demand was, people, less than 100,000 people using food banks in 2010. Now it's more, like 4 million people, households, whole households. And we're talking, a lot of people in work, nurses, teachers, primary school teachers, having to use food banks. And it's been an amazing response from football clubs, football fans. It started in Liverpool, where an Everton and a Liverpool fan started standing outside Goodison and Anfield with a wheelie bin, basically collecting for food banks. It got so huge that they now supply like a quarter of the food to North Liverpool's food banks, and there are probably 30 or 40 similar operations going on at clubs around the country. Similarly, during COVID, these organisations and football clubs, to their credit, became canteens, creating meals on wheels, delivering shopping for people who were, who couldn't go out under the lockdown, all that kind of stuff. I mean, Carlo Ancelotti and, David Moyes calling old season ticket holders to make sure they're okay. This is, football at its best. So there's that energy. The second thing, and in a way the most important thing I think probably that's happened in football in the last 15 years, and which hasn't been mentioned in the narrative so far, is the rise of women's football. It's an absolutely extraordinary moment here. After 150 years of male hegemony, 100 years, pretty much of, 70 years of active exclusion of women from football. We are in new territory. The number of women and girls is at record level playing football, growing every year. The number of teams, the number of clubs is going through the roof. The number of women at football is increasing. The Women's Super League in Britain is probably now the richest and best attended women's league anywhere in the world, in the United States. Arsenal women are filling the Emirates every single time they play there. This is, people are already used to it. It's like, really? This is so extraordinary. And of course, England women have won the Euros back to back. I mean, I never thought I'd see England win anything. And, women's football, albeit for brief moments, has been absolutely at the centre of public consciousness. I mean, that is an incredible achievement. And, the populists, it's a very manosphere, toxic masculine space, which is partly why parts of the football culture are quite receptive to its message. But I think there's no turning back on women's football. This is a really amazing transformation. And exciting, and bring something so different. I think I tell the story in the book, but I went to see England Germany at the final of Euro 2021, and I didn't hear a single reference to the Second World War. It was incredible. If that had been a men's game, that's all I'd have heard.
Nigel Farage would not like it?
No, I don't think he would.
Yeah, no, he said as much. I think you quote him in there somewhere where he complains that people aren't allowed to sing the Bomber song anymore, and that's why they're voting for him, because they can't be proper lads anymore.
Well, and that's true for a certain part. That constituency is real. He's not wrong, but there's another constituency, and in that sense, there's a battle. This is a fight, and I think that's best expressed by the way in which taking the knee by the England men's team at Euro 2020, though of course played in 21, played out, and crowds are coming back as lockdown ends, and 20% of the crowd starts booing them taking the knee. And this is hardcore England fans behind the goal are booing their own team for taking the knee. And on social media, you can see they've been imbibing the talking points of the far right, that this is a Marxist organisation and defunding the police. And what has this got to do with football? And
what's the reaction of the rest of the stadium?
Exactly.
Right?
Is that initially, and this again has been the reaction to right-wing populism and open racism, is sort of like disbelief and silence. And then the majority finally gets itself together. And by the next game, people start clapping and drowning them out. And, by the time we get to the Euros themselves, that part of the crowd has won, and they shut up. And it's like the recent by-election we've had in Wales, in Caerphilly, where Reform, which is Farage's current vehicle, went from nowhere to almost winning the seat. But the seat was ultimately won by Plaid Cymru, who are the Welsh nationalists, and they won because everybody else can see the danger of Reform, and all the votes from all the other progressive parties pile into Plaid Cymru. And that's sort of where we are, I think. Actually, there is a very noisy, angry, often racist quotient of the country. What is it, 25%? But actually the majority is not like that. And there's a battle now in all sorts of ways, in all sorts of levels, in all sectors of society, between these kind of two coalitions in a way. And football's a space where that's happening. I think it's really, where football's at its best is, you would have thought normally this kind of social movement would have been making hay with the England team, and we're going to the World Cup and we're going to win, and da. They can't do that because the team, is very rarely less than half and often more of mixed heritage or a people of colour.
Right.
And the idea that the England national football team means white and Englishness means whiteness is absolutely impossible and inconceivable, and everybody knows it. So that's a really, really interesting challenge to the populist narrative.
So David has just outlined 3 possible starting points for positive narratives that could come out of football in Great Britain. I have a little pushback on the women's football point, and I also have a suggestion for a 4th potential positive narrative. We will also talk about climate change, we'll talk about supporters' trust, we'll talk about ownership in the Premier League, and the Bristol Rovers 10 years from now. All that in the second part of our conversation in 2 weeks. I hope you're with me then still. In the meantime, you can order the book. It's out. I think you won't regret it. So David has just outlined 3 possible positive narratives in England that could come out of soccer. I have a little follow-up, maybe a little pushback on the women's football point, but we will also talk about a possible 4th narrative around the Super League protests. We'll talk about climate change in clubs. We'll talk about ownership models, the Bristol Rovers in 10 years, and some other topics in our guided tour through England's last few decades and what football has to do with that. In the meantime, between now and that second part that's coming in 2 weeks, you can order the book. It's out. As I said, I don't think you'll regret it. Injury Time is what it's called, available in both Europe and the US. I hope you're with me and David again in 2 weeks for more book talk, and hope you're well until then.